Good evening and welcome. It is time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana, 104.5 FM and UPTV. I will be your host for this evening. My name is Mr. Garza, and I'm here to let you know that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign community. Views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU or UCIMC or UPTV, as we like to say in the televised version of this show. These views are my own, and by my, in this instance, I mean myself and no one else. I'm streamlining that part of it. Anyway, there's a lot to get through here. There's a lot going on. I thought I'd start with the one thing that we mentioned this before, I think, and there's been a lot of talk about this, so I was going to read a review from the New York Times. It's entitled Immigration Nation, The Banality of Deportation. If you watch only one documentary about immigration, then by all means make it Immigration Nation, a 6-hour Netflix series that mixes reporting with an impressive amount of vivid ride-along observation. Parts of it may start to drag or feel padded, but its see-the-whole-elephant approach to one of America's most divisive issues has inherent value. It will almost certainly leave you better informed than you were before, even if its net effect may be to further entrench people on whichever side of the debate they are already occupying. Immigration to the United States is a story spread across thousands of miles, a variety of faceless government agencies, and a tapestry of determined, often desperate petitioners. An Immigration Nation tries to cover as many of its facets as it can cram in. This includes the widely known ones, like child separation at the border, as well as less familiar angles, such as the exploitation of migrants who take on the work of natural disaster recovery, and federal attempts to co-opt local law enforcement into immigration agencies. Much of the time, especially after its more fluid and immersive initial episodes, the series takes a standard television current affairs approach. And as you watch its segments, you may recall sharper or more evocative reports on the same stories by shows like Frontline, Vice, and Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. But the makers of Immigration Nation, Christina Clouseau and Shaul Schwartz, benefited from time. They filmed for nearly 3 years, and a startling degree of access, particularly to agents of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, as they rounded up immigrants, processed them for mostly deportation, and spoke to the camera about how it made them feel. And in the series' first 2 hours, the results of that embedding with ICE operations in New York, Charlotte, North Carolina, and El Paso can be startling and engrossing. Part of that effect comes from seeing agents push the boundaries of legality, most strikingly how they routinely enter apartments when invited by cowed, uncomprehending immigrants in a way that's surprisingly similar to what you see in a TV cop drama. Maybe that's where they learned it. Once inside the home of the target, probably an immigrant accused of a crime, they frequently find collaterals, additional people who can be rounded up simply because they're undocumented. Material like that, and worse, like an agent picking an apartment building's lock, gained Immigration Nation some pre-release publicity, particularly when the New York Times reported that ICE had pressured the filmmakers to delay the release and remove footage. But the real impact of the show's early episodes isn't the outrage you may feel over the thuggish tactics. It's the wearying, demoralizing depiction of a self-perpetuating bureaucracy, one that churns through the lives of people it takes little notice of, as if your trip to the DMV meant not just standing in an endless line, but then being shackled and put on a plane to Central America. The scenes inside field offices and detention centers, as agents bluffly banter with the people whose lives they're destroying, and then joke with one another about funny accents and kung pao chicken, might have been written by Kafka, except his dialogue would have been better. The series' hallmark is not an image but a soundbite, the agent's endless variations on, "I may not like it, but it's the job." The human rights lawyer Becca Heller sums it up nicely. When you add up all the people just doing their job, it becomes this crazy, terrorizing system. Immigration Nation provides an abundant evidence for things that some might call fake news, like the determination of ICE under the Trump administration to remove immigrants from the United States in bulk, regardless of whether they pose any danger. As one of the disarmingly honest agents says, they want to get rid of everybody, I guess. That will be the takeaway for those who want to make political points from the series, from either direction. And in the latter episodes, there are wrenching individual stories, like that of a Guatemalan grandmother seeking asylum and sitting for more than a year in a Texas detention center, though these segments tend to indulge in superfluous scenes of inspiration and tearful condolence. But what sticks with you from Immigration Nation is its up-close depiction of the banality of deportation, of the huge disconnect between the everyday people of ICE and the Border Patrol and the everyday people they detain, arrest, and process. In El Paso, a morning meeting at a detention center ends with the chant, 1, 2, 3, processing. Agent after agent expresses an ambivalence about the job that's given its most extreme expression by an Arizona ICE investigator who says, I put my personal feelings aside, which, yeah, maybe that's what every Nazi said, right? But he immediately adds, I actually believe in the cause of trying to enforce some sort of sovereignty over your borders, and no one's figured out a better way to do it yet. It's a nice summation of the schism within the country at large that will keep us talking past one another despite the filmmaker's best efforts. It's a show that I have not seen it yet, and so I can't comment beyond just my general understanding of how immigration affects the communities that it is targeting. And I can say from that description, it sounds very much like what I would have imagined. It's easy for those of us who work against ICE and feel strongly about the topic to think of them as evil and vicious and hateful people. But in reality, it seems very likely that this is correct, that they're just people, some who may have evil and or vicious sides to them, but others who just kind of are able to sort of turn off their humanity and kind of do what they do, and maybe they only see just a small enough portion of what they're doing that they don't really have to think too much about what came before it and what happens after it. And I think that's how I think the term banality of evil is really appropriate here, because that's really how most evil is accomplished. Some of it is passionate, sure. Some of it is violent in the moment, I hate you, I'm going to do something terrible to you. And joy at the suffering of the person that they're doing something to. But in reality, I think most of the real evil in the world is more like what they're describing here. Just kind of people who are able to not think very deeply about the effects of their actions, going through those actions, making those actions normal to the extent that they just don't really think about it. At the end of the day, they go home and they go, oh, it was a tough day today. I had to process 40 people. Usually we only do 30. It's extra paperwork. It annoyed me because I had to stay late and do extra paperwork. That kind of thing. The dehumanizing of things. I read, this is kind of a strange aside, but it's sort of similar in a sense. A thing the other day, it was a person who worked at, I think, in a coffee shop, who was writing about an exchange they had with a customer. They had a wear a mask sign on the door. All the customers are required to wear masks at all times in the shop. And a customer came in with a mask who didn't have it on. They were just carrying it. And the person in the shop said, this was the only customer in there, and the person in the shop said, well, you're required to wear a mask while you're in the shop. And the customer said, why? There's nobody here. It's like, and I am who? I am no one. I am working here, and I am just part of the furniture. People tend to see folks in service industries as just, I don't know, as machinery, part of the machinery, like going into an automat and putting money in a machine. If the machine takes your money and doesn't give you your food, you're mad and you bang on it. And if the person in the shop doesn't give you your hamburger fast enough, I just read last night about someone who was in, I think it was Burger King, who was angry because his food was taking too long, and he shot and killed the person working there. You willing to kill somebody because your food is taking too long? It's that kind of ability to depersonalize and not even see others as human that is the true face of evil, I think, anywhere. And this description of the film about immigration is really spot on, I think, in the way it describes how the whole process is just boring and repetitive and dehumanizing. And that's what makes it work. That's what perpetuates it. And that's what makes it so evil. And it's something we need to push back against, because we are people. We're all people. All of us. Immigrants are people. Citizens, local people, the natives to the country are people, and immigrants coming here are people. And we're just people from different places doing different things, having different reasons for why we do what we do. And it's really, really, really important to see each other as people at all times, regardless of any other differences we may have with each other. Anyway, that's my little rant for the day. I thought this one was kind of interesting. This is entitled Coronavirus Perfect Storm Engulfs Marshall Islanders in the U.S. There are a lot of immigrants and different minority groups that we don't think about very often, that we don't hear about a lot. It's almost like the majority minority folks get the most attention. And so we see, Black Lives Matter and, worrying about Mexican immigrants. And these groups rise to the top because their concerns are important, and there are enough of the people involved and the people who care about the people involved to raise the profile of these struggles. But there are other folks who are in smaller groups, in kind of tucked away and hidden away in different places that we don't hear about, that are equally affected, that have equally intense struggles. They just don't have enough population to publicize those struggles or to make their concerns a public matter that people care about. So this is an example of one group like that. So the story reads, the coronavirus has turned into the perfect storm for thousands of Marshall Islanders living in the United States. Since March, Marshallese have experienced extraordinary COVID-19 infection and death rates in many American states. The most vulnerable people in the United States, in almost every state where there are large numbers of Pacific Islanders, the most vulnerable people in the United States in almost every state where there are large numbers of Pacific Islanders are Pacific Islanders, says Marshall Islands Health Secretary Jack Niedenthal in Majuro. And of those Pacific Islanders, Marshallese are the most vulnerable. An exodus of Marshallese to the United States over the past 3 decades has seen many islanders benefit from jobs, education, and healthcare opportunities not available at home. A visa-free provision of the Compact of Free Association Treaty with the United States opened the door to greener pastures and saw Marshallese flock to many parts of the United States, but particularly Midwestern states where employment is plentiful in meat processing factories. The benefits were many, and the number of Marshall Islanders and from the two other freely associated states in the North Pacific migrating to the U.S. skyrocketed after the treaty containing visa-free access was approved in 1986. The combined migrant populations in U.S. areas grew by an estimated 68%, from around 56,000 to about 94,000 from 2009 to 2018, said the U.S. General Accounting Office in a report issued last month. The spread of COVID-19 in the U.S. abruptly changed life in America from a blessing to a curse for many Marshallese who are experiencing virus infection and death rates many times above the average in states in which they live. In one city in Washington state, Marshallese make up 1% of the population and 30% of the coronavirus cases. In northwest Arkansas, home to multiple meat processing plants that employ thousands of islanders and have been hit hard by COVID-19, they account for half of the deaths in that area. This is a confluence of chronic health problems, high-risk work locations, and cultural norms. Over a quarter of all Marshallese adults have type 2 diabetes, the third highest country rate of the chronic illness globally. The heavy diabetes affliction has resulted from changing lifestyle patterns of islanders who were once self-reliant on isolated islands, but in the past several decades have moved to urban areas where diets based on white rice and processed meats coupled with little exercise have contributed to an epidemic of diabetes and other chronic illnesses. Arkansas health authorities reported that 14 of the first 28 people to die of COVID-19 in northwest Arkansas had type 2 diabetes, and 12 of them were Marshallese. Not all U.S. states include a Pacific Islander designation or a Marshallese box to check for healthcare workers filling out health data. But for the ones that do, the rate of infection and death among Marshallese and other Pacific Islanders is far out of proportion to their populations. In Hawaii, Pacific Islanders are 4% of population, but account for 23% of COVID-19 cases through June 26th, at 158 cases per 10,000 people in Oregon as of July 1st. Pacific Islanders are getting the virus at almost 8 times the state average of 20 per 10,000. And in Arkansas, they are 0.3% of the state's population, but accounted for 8% of the COVID-19 cases as of late June. COVID-19 has been devastating for freely associated states' Marshallese citizens in certain areas of the U.S., said Mr. Niedenthal. Aside from serious underlying health conditions that raise the risk of serious illness or death for Marshallese, Mr. Niedenthal cited reasons why the spread of COVID-19 has been problematic in islander communities in the U.S. One reason is fairly straightforward for this quick spread of COVID in their communities. They can't seem to break with their customs of having their important social gatherings for birthdays, funerals, weddings, and church services, he said. Secondly, when an islander gets sick, the Marshallese kind, humanistic ways make them want to surround this sick person and take care of them, not isolate them. Health workers in various U.S. states with large Marshallese populations, concerned by the rapid spread of COVID-19 in Marshallese communities, reached out to the Niedenthal and health workers in this island region last week for advice to improve connections with local Marshallese communities in U.S. cities for more effective COVID-19 prevention. A report issued last week on the situation of Marshall Islanders in Arkansas by the country's Ministry of Foreign Affairs bluntly observed, "We are unhealthy. Most of the deceased Marshallese here had underlying illnesses, cancer, diabetes, renal disease, and hypertension." Dr. Adam Moss, an endocrinologist for Northwest Health Systems in Arkansas, said people with type 2 diabetes are at high risk for severe illness and death if they get the virus. In comments to the Arkansas Democrat Gazette earlier this week, Dr. Moss expressed particular worry about the Marshallese living in northwest Arkansas because they have a high level of diabetes and also because they work in meat processing and other essential industries. All of that has made them very, very vulnerable, he said. As COVID-19 spreads rapidly across the United States, closing in on 3 million cases this week, the Marshall Islands has remained free of COVID-19 by keeping its borders locked down since March 8th. The government's chief secretary, Kino Kabua, issued the 15th COVID-19 travel advisory July 3rd, extending the ban on inbound travel to August 5th. The way cultural norms have helped COVID-19 infections flourish among Marshallese communities in the U.S. underlies the determination of the Marshall Islands to prevent the virus from entering these islands. One of the reasons we are fighting so hard to keep COVID out of the Marshall Islands is for these very same reasons, said Mr. Niedenthal. We fear we won't be able to stop people from doing what they believe are mandatory expressions of love and faith in their culture. Brief edit there. Had to turn the light on because it was getting dark outside. I think it might be going to rain. In any event, if you're interested in the Marshall Islands, there's a film. I don't exactly know how to pronounce it. It's spelled Tarinae, Tarinai. It's about the Marshall Islands. It's actually about a Japanese soldier who lived for a while on the Marshall Islands during the war and who left a diary behind, and his son's going on a visit to learn more about where his father died and how he gets to know people from the islands. And it's a fascinating story, and I mention it in part because the proceeds from this film will be donated to support organizations that help the Marshallese who are living in the United States and suffering from COVID right now. So it's Tarinae, Tarinae, and it might be worth checking out if you get a chance. Anyway, one thing I liked about this article that I just read was that they made an attempt anyway to explain why the Marshallese people are suffering from COVID so much and not sort of blame them for their own health issues. Because what a lot of people, I think, don't understand about immigration or immigrants generally is that it's often a very big leap from where they come from to when they get here. And the notion of assimilation that you hear people talking about all the time, I think is primarily caused by a desire not to be confronted by difference. And so, or to be affected by difference, or even to have to deal with it in any way. You know, if you got a strange name, just call yourself Chuck or something, you know, just make an American name so I don't have to work any harder at understanding you or speaking to you or dealing with you than I would with anybody else that I run into. And one of the things that a lot of people suffer from are illnesses and health problems related to the kinds of food that they eat. Here in the U.S., we have sort of, I don't know, excelled at the art of making non-food that is edible. So a lot of junk food, a lot of fast food, a lot of processed food that we eat a lot of, you know, of the puffed rice, corn chip, soda pop, you know, all these different things that we think of as junk food, in a lot of instances are really only food in the very broadest sense of the use of the term. I mean, it's really just a way of packaging addictive and sort of sense-pleasing things like sugar and salt in edible ways that don't really provide any nutrition whatsoever. And so when you exist on a diet of that, it is very, very unhealthy. And a lot of Americans are very, very unhealthy. And a lot of people, but at least here in the US, it's been a slow, steady progress towards this pseudo food for generations. The people grew up eating things. I mean, when I was young, almost everything I ate came out of a can or it was frozen or something like that. And I had not tasted a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables ever until I became, at least in my teens or later. I didn't even know what, like a fresh pineapple. I had no idea. I was shocked to taste that. I thought pineapple was going to be squishy and super, super sweet. And it turns out to be sour and kind of, chewy and crisp. And there are many things like that I just had no idea about because I never, ate those things. I had never learned what they were like. Never been introduced to them. So a lot of people who come here from other societies, they don't have the generations of slowly getting used to eating food with, 2,000 more % of salt than one would normally put on something, or 50 times the sugar that you might ever run into in your entire life. And so they suffer from health problems related to those things at a much higher rate. And at least this story made an attempt to sort of vaguely explain that in a way that didn't say, well, it's their own fault. They come here and they eat crap and they live in these lazy lives and that's how they, that's why they're so sick. It's not their fault. They come here to do what they can do, and our society confines them to certain kind of lifestyle because of the kinds of work that they have available to them or the places that they can live, and the food that they have available to them. So this is what they have to work with, and they do their best with it. And I also liked that they try to express the cultural differences that make people more vulnerable to certain kinds of infectious diseases like this, that are not just like, well, they're stupid and they don't know better and they don't know how to socially isolate, but that they really feel the necessity to be together and live together in these ways because that is part of their cultural upbringing. That is as much ingrained into their culture as anything that you might just take for granted is the norm. Like you have to put pants on before you go out of the house in the morning. I mean, we just do that because everywhere you go, that is required, and your entire life that has been required. So it's just normal. But what if somebody told you, well, you can't do that. You can't wear pants because if you do, you're going to get pants-itis and you'll get sick, might get sick and die. And you'd be like, well, it's a risk I have to take because I've got to wear pants. So anyway, I'm kind of getting carried away here, but it's definitely something that pays to think about when we think about immigrants generally and any particular cultures in particular cultures in particular, to try to get some sense or to have some sense of where they're coming from